I wrote a few notes, so I'll be looking up a little bit at some of my notes as I'm speaking, and also just talking off the cuff based on rehearing some of the presentations again. So for me, the session today and last month featured a number of what I see as intellectually rich interventions. And these papers, these interventions, aim to rethink and experiment with the notion of education and learning in this period called the Anthropocene. And together they really provoke my thinking. So thank you for inviting me to be a discussant in this session and to give me the time and the provocation to think through some really difficult things that have come in and out of my mind over the last year or two. And there's an amazing number of connections I always find when you're asked to do something like this, not only between the papers, and I'll comment on some of those connections, but one of my colleagues is Veronica Puccini-Ketchabaugh. And so I get to work with her, and it's so great. And recently she had Dr. Africa Taylor come and speak, and I heard her. So I've been thinking about a lot of these things, and I just love it when the synchronicity happens. Like one thing happens in one part of your life, and then there's other connections, and you're like, there's something going on here. So very exciting to be a part of it. So the papers provoked my thinking about lots of different things. Education, obviously and clearly, and pedagogy, development, what it means to be human, what it means to be human in the world today, notions around humanitarianism, citizenship, nationalism, lots of different sort of big thinking, big idea concepts. So thank you again for that. My comments really are just focused on the three papers today. I initially made an attempt to listen to Gilberto's presentation, but my Spanish isn't good enough for that. So hopefully Inés might have a little bit more to say about his paper. And I think that also speaks to the privileging of the English language in these kind of conference sessions. And I just want to put that out there as my own limitation and how that is privileging just one of many languages that exist in the world today. I can't not engage and think about what you have said in these papers without thinking about this current COVID-19 crisis that we're existing within. And I think that what I'm saying is probably the same that many people are feeling today. It's sort of like is this big thing that just, for me, is just shaping everything that I'm doing and thinking about in the context of my work and my personal life as well. And in my comments, I'm going to flag or turn to Donna Haraway, whose work has influenced a lot of your work as well. And I just think so many of her words are words of wisdom. And she talks about staying with the trouble and sort of like trying to think about what that means in the context of these presentations and in our lives today, in these very troubling times that we exist in. And she's not the only one, and many of you have alerted us to the fact that the work we do as researchers is so clearly relational. We exist and we do our work in relation to the world around us, in relation to the subjects or the participants that we work with in our studies, the people in our lives. And right now, I think that this virus, we are in relationship in a way with the virus. It's really shaping how we do our work. The fact that this conference was shifted to a completely virtual conference, there's this virus. Like it's incredible to me to see how that's come together, and it just completely reshapes and reforms what we do, how we're able to do what we do, how we're not able to do certain things. You know, the Zoom bombers and how they sort of intervened in this session and made it into something different. And the fact that we're coming back a month later to talk about this, it's just so fascinating to me. And so I think it really illustrates that nothing that we don't do anything without being in relation to something else. And right now that something else for me is that virus that is so clear in the world, and it's a non-human actor, and many of you talked about that. So while in the Anthropocene, we talk a lot about how humans have shaped, controlled, and to a large degree completely screwed up the planet because of what we've done to the planet. At the same time, ironically, we are now at the mercy of this virus, this non-human actor that has really taken over our lives and shaped every single aspect of it, our daily lives, from the time we get up to the time that we go to bed in the evening. So in many ways, even though it is the Anthropocene, I think we're in less control of our own lives than we ever have been. And so enough about that, to put it out there. So I'm going to talk about some of the things I liked about the presentation, some of the presentations, and some of the questions that came to my mind from the presentations. I really liked, as you can figure from my comments, the focus on non-human actors across all of the presentations. I loved, in particular, the focus on land. Land just plays a really big part of all of the work that you're doing in Zsuzsa and Sirpa's study of the ways in which the nation is produced through maps. The notion of the land is also present and not present in Nisha's work about the multi-billion-dollar humanitarian industry, and also in Janna's nature culture ethnography. So land is so important in all of your pieces. So well done in bringing that out and reminding us about the need to attend to the land and to the beyond human worlds in the work that we do, and to remind us that everything that we do as humans is always entangled within those worlds and entangled in assemblages. So a lot of questions came to mind from these presentations, some more obvious than others. The great big one, what does it mean to be human? Big existential question. And also then, what does it mean to think beyond the human, beyond an anthropocentric view of the world? The presentations also made me think about, excuse me, what are the different stories or the meta-narratives that we've been told about the world around us, and how have those big stories, those big meta-narratives shaped what we think is true, correct, real, right, and accept those things, and how hard it is to kind of push back against those in academia. I think you're all doing that in different ways, and once again, I commend you for that. And then what I love about your work is that not only are you pushing back against dominant meta-narratives about how we think about the world around us and how we think about that world, how we think about our roles as researchers in the context of the world around us, but how we can remake that relationship and remake or re-envision that world and create new scripts and new ways of restorying. I think one of you, I can't remember who, sorry, said in one of your presentations. And then to bring it to what we do, we're comparative and international education researchers. So what does all this mean for education? What does it mean for learning? How are we and how might we rethink how we go about learning and teaching in a world that attends to the beyond human? To me, all of the papers interrupt our thinking and provide us with new ways to challenge those dominant meta-narratives and raise different questions, to embrace learning, again, to turn to Donna Haraway as a becoming with. And Janna, I think you engaged with that idea really well. But I think it's also how we can embrace and think about learning as becoming with, and also helping as becoming with. And Nisha, you were looking at this notion of helping as well. I wonder how we can reimagine education beyond the human as a relational process, to go back to some of my earlier comments, a relational process of learning as worlding and becoming with the earth and all the species within it. as Janna noted in her presentation, we're not autonomous. Education is always about becoming with the world. And again, this brings to my mind Donna Haraway's notion of common worlding in the world around us. And I think I've said enough about that. I recently, and this might be quite well known to all of you, again, Haraway talks about a new era as an alternative to the Anthropocene, the Thulocene, and I think it's drawn from Greek mythology. And it's, in my understanding, it's a time and a space for learning to stay with the trouble that I was talking about earlier, of living and dying, and our responsibility, our ability to respond to this very damaged and this very troubled earth that we live within. And I think you've done that well. I'm going to end with a few comments, and I can't remember who's. I think it's Zsuzsa and Sirpa's presentation made me think about this because of the aspect of Australia. Years ago, I read this book by Bruce Curtis. It's called Songlines, and some of you might be familiar with it. And if you're not, the idea is more important than the book itself. And the idea comes from the Aboriginal people in Australia. And they talk about songlines, which are also called dreaming tracks. And they're paths across the land, and sometimes in the sky. And they align with the overall belief system of Aboriginal Australians. And they mark the paths of the creators that happened during what was called the dreaming time, the creation time. And these song lines are part of songs and stories and dances and the ceremonies as well. And so they're a vital part of Aboriginal culture and the belief that the world was sang into existence. So I almost think as if you're all contributing to creating new song lines for academia, and those new song lines, for me, they help us to be thinking about how we do our work and who we are as humans in a way that engages with all the many parts of the world that are beyond the human world indeed. So thank you once again. That's it. I'm sorry I was very long-winded there. I hope I didn't go on too long. Look forward to further discussion. So I'll turn it over to Inés now.
Well, many thanks for inviting me too. And yes, it's this month is very strange, I would say. I was yesterday giving a talk, and I was quoting actually Lenin, the Soviet revolutionary. And Lenin once said that sometimes decades, there are decades in which nothing happens, and then you have weeks in which decades happen. No, and I have this feeling that every week is like, wow, it was just a month ago, or it was like 2 years ago, and I don't know, and everything is suspended, but yet it is very, deaccelerated. And there's also a way in which you think, well, this is a different world, in which we are living with. And so I think it's very timely, and I totally agree with what Marianne was saying, this conversation about the Anthropocene and this conversation about the more than human, and also our lives with more than human, and also very human. So, well, first of all, thank you, and thank you also. And I'm very glad that we could finally have this panel, because it's good for all of us, to continue working and overcome all the difficulties that are emerging. So briefly about the 4 papers, I think they are very different. I would say that 3 of them are post-humanist, post-structuralist, and then we have Gilberto's paper, which is very different. And for me, it was, even though I can understand the Spanish, it was not that easy to engage with the perspective. I think Gilberto's paper is still framed within the human will to shape and control the world, the planet. Is quite prescriptive, you have to, he's looking at educational experiences that want to educate children differently. But still based upon this idea that what matters is human behavior upon the planet, and not a relationship with the planet, on equal terms. So I would leave that a little aside. I think it's very interesting. I don't think it's not important. I think it's important. Yet I think it's what Zsuzsa and Janna and Nisha are bringing is more challenging in terms of thinking differently and trying to think differently about how we relate and intervene, no, in the world and relate to what non-human actors are doing to us. So also if I had to think about schools and education more broadly, you have Zsuzsa and Sirpa's paper and Gilberto's paper, who are thinking about schools. Then you have Nisha and Janna, who are looking beyond schools. But still, I mean, how you think about school, Zsuzsa and Sirpa's paper is definitely looking at it in terms, not in terms of social or children's consciousness, no, but or changing conducts, but it's that this assemblage of human and non-human actors or actants, no, how maps are constituting how we see the world and how we interact with the world, how we perform the nation, no. But then also, if I think about the beyond school, Nisha's and Janna's paper is also different, because I think you are both are looking at what I would say is an ecological principle in research, no, trying to think about what the earth, what is going on with the earth, with the land. Yet I think Nisha is more related to the human, no, in humanitarianism and human voices, while Janna wants to go beyond, no, the binaries of nature and culture, and you are trying to produce research that is done ecologically, no, and give voice to the what you call the ghost writers, no, of our narratives. So I think the three of your papers are really very, very interesting. I'll go briefly into Zsuzsa's and Sirpa's paper, although I sent you some notes, so I will try not to repeat them, but I think it's for me, it's fascinating to use to look at the use of maps in classrooms everywhere. I think it's a technology, it's an artifact that we don't really study enough, because it's definitely one of the notions in which we get to know a sense of space, no, and a sense of positionality and understanding of the world, no, very representational, very abstract, no. And I think it gives a lot of ground to thinking about everyday nationalism, no, and the performance of everyday nationalism, and learning as a bodily performance, as an interaction with artifacts, no, and it's not just the mind, but it's how you relate to concrete artifacts. I liked a lot your interrogation of the pedagogy of the nation from the point of view of the materiality of the nation. I think you have a very good example of these connections. And also the focus on the practices or borderings, no? The bordering practices. I think it's also a very interesting concept that you could follow up in other articles, or any of us. I think it's really something to work with, no? Learning about borders, learning through borders, no? And how borders are connected, these interconnections between objects and humans, no? Affects and cognition, no? So I think you have great points. One of my suggestions would be, and also because I am partly, or I am a historian of education, is also the history and the specificity of the map in early childhood education. Because I've seen lots of pictures of maps, and I'm trying to start a small collection of pictures of maps and children in schools, no? From the 1910s, 1920s, and you see pictures I've seen pictures from India, from Australia, from Argentina, from Mexico, from Spain. I don't know, it seemed like a very common pedagogical practice. But in a way I've seen, and I looked at my collection and I couldn't see anyone from kindergarten. No? And so the idea that in a way it contradicts this constructivist credo that you cannot use, you cannot use abstract concepts or artifacts, no, at this young age. So for me, these tensions between these constructivist pedagogies, no, that you have to remain very attached to simple material forms, and then you have the map, which is not simple in a way; it's very abstract, no, and it brings in all this piece of the nationalist, no, the performance of the nation, no, in early childhood education, and it brings, in a way, it's not interrogated, it's not problematized, or it's in tension with these constructivist pedagogies. For me, that's very interesting. Also, another question I had is related, I mean, this is not a question, but this was a suggestion, but maybe this would be more of a question, no? The nation as being simultaneously reflexive, but also unreflexive, no? And so I don't know if you can say more about this bordering of reflection and non-reflection, no? And what gets to be reflected in early childhood education, what doesn't get to be reflected, which languages are brought in to talk about or feel or engage with a nation, which ones are privileged, which ones are silenced, no? And in a way, it seems that verbalization is privileged, no? But then what other things are going on? The touching, no? The feeling, the hearing, the singing, I don't know. No? And then you have this stress on human-made artifacts and inscriptions, and maybe it's different from Janna's attempts, no, to look about nature culture together, no, or maybe not, I don't know. No? So I would say that the map still bounces to some sort of produced artifact, no, and there is no connection to nature, and so maybe you can trace more these links between nation and nature, no. Because the map seems to be more of an urban abstract performance of the nation, yet it's used in rural schools too. No? So I don't know, I think that's interesting to include more reflection on the inscription and the abstraction and what does this mean. So now I move to Nisha's paper. I think it's also fascinating the work you are doing on humanitarian work as an industry and also discussing it from a post-colonial perspective. I think it's a very exciting project. And I have two questions there, two questions/comments. You know, one is, who are these foreign participants you are interviewing? In a way, I mean, for me, it was interesting how in your records and how in your analysis also the way that cosmopolitans and parochial seems to be played out. No? And in a way, I mean, these cosmopolitan selves that they are self-critical or discussing what other humanitarian workers are doing, they also seem to have a very parochial view, because they think, well, all are white privileged Americans, and in a way, is that all? And I was thinking here, I mean, the readings I've been doing on this, for example, I don't know if you read anything by Didier Fassin, he's a French, but he works in the US. He has a wonderful work on humanitarianism. He's an anthropologist, political anthropologist, I would say. And he has this French, I would say, in that way, I'm saying perhaps all of us are parochial in some ways, but then if you have several parochialisms, then you understand your own a little different. So for me, Didier Fassin or Fassin's work, he has this French view of the work of for example, how is it called? Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders, in Africa and the Middle East, or human rights activators, more, I would say, European. And I think there is some difference, there in some nuances, I would say, that are important, and I was thinking there also as another reading, Homi Bhabha's debates on the dissemination of human rights and the complexities it involves. I think it's in his work, The Right to Narrate, because he says, well, we can discuss the westernization of human rights. On the other hand, how human rights are played out, it's very complex, because they also allow for more democratic struggles sometimes, and what humanitarian workers do sometimes, also they become local actors in many ways. It's not, I think the the colonial critique is one aspect, but then there is not the only aspect, because you have to also locate them in local struggles in which they might play differently. Also, there is a great book by Thomas Keenan, The Flood of Rights, in that same line. Thomas Keenan is a political philosopher. He works a lot with humanitarianism and images, and human rights. And so I think it's called The Flood of Rights. It's a wonderful book with Ariel Azoulay, many other really groundbreaking intellectuals. So I would recommend you to take these perspectives also in order to maybe get a more complex idea of the cosmopolitanism, and the parochialism. And then the second question is, who are the local participants, who get to speak for the communities? How do you construct a notion of community knowledge through these interviews? Because then you are also, I mean, in any case, when we do interviews, we are getting access to particular voices, no? And then it's easy to say, well, these are the foreign, the humanitarian and criticize, and then these are the local and these are the good ones. But then, no? Being many times involved in the local, with the local ones, then I can see a lot of problems also in these local voices that we can reach, no? And which we get to interview. Finally, I move on to Janna's paper. Very, very interesting, very playful. And you are right, this is uncharted territory. No? I think it's wonderful that you are trying to follow Haraway's, no, and other intellectuals who are trying to think otherwise and write otherwise. I like a lot your challenge, your provocation to, as Marianne was saying, about thinking about how do we do a multi-species, multi-matter, no, narration. No? But then I would recommend that you also interrogate what is narration for you, no? And which kind of narration is it possible from animals or trees, no? So you want to give voice to nature, you record the sounds of trees and birds, etc. You give cameras and recorders to subjects, but what are the genres of narration that appear there, no? And I was thinking, of course, this Homi Bhabha national narration, but also Benjamin, what is narration? Which language does it mobilize? And if you don't have to interrogate these technologies of inscriptions, sorry, I'm now in 14 minutes. The technologies of inscription, because I've done work with youth and producing videos, no, media. And then when you give them cameras, the kind of things that come out are the genres of narration that they have, which is, I don't know, video clips or documentaries, no, denunciations, but not necessarily their voice. It's always mediated by these technologies of inscription and by the genres they have available. No, I think this remains a difficult question. Finally, I was, when I read your stuff and now when I was listening now to the video, I mean, it's like, there were some ideas that were a bit troubling, but then as Donna Haraway says, we have to stay with the trouble, and that's okay. But then you say, for example, if I find it here, the tree didn't know that it would become, you know, candle. I said, well, but do we need to use the knowing? I mean, does the tree know? And so in a way, and I was thinking, and I was reading this book by Isabel Stengers. I don't know if you can see it, no? Résister au désastre, so resisting disaster. And she has there a good piece, a debate with another French, Baptiste Morisot. Well, she's not French, she's Belgian. But, and this Morisot says, well, we have to make a pact with the wolves, no? The wolves observe us, no? They follow us, they smell us, they interact with us, they are intelligent. And Stenger says, yeah, it's okay, they might be intelligent or not, I don't know, they smell us, they interact with us. But Stenger says, we don't have to move to the idea of the pact. We don't need the idea that we have to make a pact, no? The coexistence is our problem, not theirs. They would not be co-authors, no? We have to live with them. Also, we have to live with the peasants who have to endure the predatory practices of wolves. We have to protect, no? And they have to protect themselves, the peasants. So Stenger says we have to find ways to live with them, but we cannot give them voice in the sense of we cannot give them like a human agency. We have to deal with that, no? So in a way, I would say I sometimes see this this risk in your work that you are, you know, trying to give them a reflexive kind of agency, and I don't think we need to. Don't need to go there. No, the tree doesn't know, and it doesn't matter. We still can. We have to learn to live differently with them. No, and as Stenger says, this is our problem, and it's okay for me to frame it that way. But I don't know. I also would like to hear your comments on that. So I stop here. Many thanks again for letting me in and making me live with these provocations, which were very interesting. So passing to you.
Thank you so much. That's amazing. I don't know how we go about addressing all the questions. I think if I can just jump in with the knowing tree off the top of my head, since that's the last thing. What helps us to work with those questions is thinking that the trees do know, that they do have generational knowledge that they pass on to their kin, and that they talk to each other through the gases in the earth and everything. So that's such a good question that you raised about knowing beings, because the way I frame my theoretical approach is to deal with the Cartesian divide of human and nature by saying, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? It doesn't have to be a human to hear it to make a sound. A bird could hear it. The other trees could feel the disruption of the airwaves. Like, it doesn't have to be a knowing human. But I also find it troubling that to protect nature, sometimes we assign human rights to nature. So we give human rights to a river to make sure that it's protected. So that is a very troubling conversation. And it's really exciting that you brought up that question. And I think the choice to say that the tree didn't know was an intentional choice that I made. But I'm going to sit with the question for a while. I don't know how we can address all of the questions at once, but I thought maybe we could each sort of talk about the title of this session, about experimenting with and rethinking education in the Anthropocene, and then how everyone's questions tie into that. But maybe we could also just open it up for everyone at this point. I don't know, Zsuzsa and Nisha, how you want to go about this. We got such great feedback, and the conversation doesn't end here in 30 minutes. We can still have it online and we can continue it, but I just don't know how to go about it. Nisha?
Yeah, I wonder if, I think that was such wonderful feedback, and thank you so much, and thank you for recommending things to read. I love that. I wonder if we could each take 5 minutes to just for ourselves respond, and then after that open it to questions and discussion. Is that something that would work?
Absolutely. You want to take the first?
Sure. So just quickly, I will respond to Inés's comments on the my participants, and just to say I'm really in the middle of analyzing my data right now. So thank you for bringing this up, because it is really interesting to have someone listen to my very pre-analysis of my work and point some things out. So super helpful. It is a really important part of my work, is thinking about citational practice and how do we cite and how do we collect data, and what are the methods that we work with our data. This is something that I'm really pushed by my supervisor, Eve Tuck, to look at all the time and to think about. So one thing I'll say is that, yes, this question around who is local and who gets to represent community is very much an issue for me. And I spend a huge amount of my method section talking about the existential crisis that I think all researchers need to be thinking about, especially when they're collecting data from Indigenous communities, from what we call local communities, racialized and marginalized communities, and how important it is to actually, first of all, sit back and say, should I even be doing this work? It took me years to get around to doing work on this. And what I came to was, there's a part of my work that looks at humanitarianism. And what happened to me is I was going to do that work without collecting data and without visiting the Thailand-Myanmar border. And I told some friends about it there, and they got really kind of passionate and asking me, why on earth aren't you coming here to talk to us about this? So then it became a project that thinks about my learning is actually rooted and grounded in work that I was doing before in this place. And so my critique about humanitarianism comes from my work in international development. So my understanding of all of this comes from these people that I worked with for years. So I better ground the work in what I've learned from them and in their knowledge. So that's kind of how I came to it. And then in terms of who I talk to, most of the people that I talk to are people that I've worked with for many years and that I know, or were referred to me by people that I knew. So it is really rooted in relationships. And I think this is something important for researchers to be thinking about, is when we do research, how are we coming about to our research subjects, and where are they coming from? And the only thing I can say about making sure that the participants are sort of representing or having strong critiques is that they all of them had been doing the work for at least 10 years. And so something interesting to me about this question of humanitarianism and who is the human is that it was foreigners who came with these very visceral critiques of international development aid, but these foreigners are people who've been doing work in Myanmar for over 25 years. Like the ones who are most visceral are the ones who've been there longest. So that was kind of interesting. And there was an interesting evasion or not meeting the question by locals. And those locals have also had huge amount of experience, like 10 to 15 years, where a couple of Karen people were like, yeah, we're really like cynical about this idea of development. But others were mostly kind of like, yeah, you know, they're good people doing this work. So just to say, a major part of my citational practice is actually getting data and grounding my research in citing the work that local groups have already been doing. Like they do produce, like community-based organizations produce huge amounts of work and research on that they do in their own communities. And so using their work and data that is from them and citing them is an important part of that. So I'm still picking apart how all of that works. And I just wanted to quickly say this idea of mapping. I do have notes from everyone's work and it's all so wonderful, but I just, for Zsuzsa, what you were saying about how you make the maps or how the maps and borderings work, I just was thinking about how much these notions of nationalism and mapping actually displace our attention from land. And how we know that that's the case because of the unprecedented amount of walls being built right now around in Europe, and the big one down south in the United States. Actually, they're building the wall right now. They've been accelerating wall building while this pandemic has been going on. And one of the things that they've been doing is just ripping apart one of the massive national parks in Arizona and just destroying the ecosystems that are there. And so these are lines, like the lines are so artificial, but they're drawn across ecosystems and plants and animals. And when you put up fences, you actually stop migrations that are really necessary for the interrelationships that we talk about for the natural world. And so it just was something that popped out for me, and other things popped out, but I don't want to take any more time.
I would be very happy to listen to more, but maybe we can do it. Maybe I email you later. And I think it's a good jumping board for me to start, because it was very surprising that Inés brought up this relation to land, the map, because I never thought of it that way for the same reason, right? Because I thought that this is such a construction that we learn to understand space and place. The same as, we try to devise a language to speak about something. So that's a language for space for us. And it's a very dominant view, while so many other views also exist. So I think it's this geographic imagination that I had as part of, this relation to nation. And then I think that this presentation provoked us with Sirpa, and she's listening to me, to actually expand our thinking into this more than human and materialities more. And we started to think really intensively how we can connect this. And that's when we started to read on other things. So it was a really good exercise, and I'm very happy that we started to do that, because I wanted to go there. And what I want to say is that I think the pedagogical method that is very important for us. So not just to debunking, but to, as beautifully Inés was talking about, and also Marianne, this new storying of the nation. So we can learn this together with children. And here, for me, it was very important, these non-human socialities, and how to create with these different types of communities stories of the nation. And here I would include, you know, living communities such as forests or other life forms, that trees, fungus, or something that Singh is also talking about beyond animals, that is already conceptualized by some. And then what would be also the ground for this, because now we are living together, we are living in maybe in democracies, but what would be that new idea, which is not based on freedom and some morality, you know, agreed morality or planned actions of how we live together, but something that can include actually the more than human world. And then it requires, you know, really rethinking these relations and ideas. And I think that for me, Singh was very thought-provoking here, because she's talking about mushrooms that expresses maybe freedom by growing into different shapes instead of acting. So it's this shaping is an idea of freedom that was very nice idea for me. And how then we can build on these notions of freedom and relationalities, a different form of socialities, to create these new stories and to then talk about our land or our belonging to land or belonging to the motherland, you know, as we would say in nationalism, right? Differently. So I think that that's where I could see something that is really productive in bringing together nationalism and this common word type of thinking and thinking with the more than human. And I have to say that I looked very much in nationalism studies, and they are not really working in this way. So I was very surprised, but also kind of encouraged to think this way. So I really, really like this space that we can go with this.
Yes, I'll jump in. Thank you so much for the provocative questions. This is by far the most engaging CIES experience personally that I've gotten to have about our work here. So I really appreciate the time you took to come the first time and come again, and to share these comments and to continue this conversation. I think the two things that stand out that I would like to address now are the idea of the Thulacene that Marianne brought up. Something in my work that I find challenging is to try and understand. So the Thulacene and the Anthropocene, as we learned from Afrika in one of the keynotes, they exist at the same time. These are both spaces that we can be in. And I struggle in my own life to understand when I'm in the Thulacene. When do I know that I'm thinking with the Thulacene, and when do I realize that I'm just really stuck in the Anthropocene, and how can I identify a difference? And so that's been the hardest part of the work, was trying to resist the pull to the Anthropocene, where I already feel that I am all the time, to access the Thulacene and think with the Thulacene, so that I can stay with the trouble. And I think that's what's really exciting about this session today is the question that Inés raised, because I'm not sure I even agree with the answer I already gave, or my response that I already gave. I'm still thinking about, well, isn't it troubling that that I assigned that not knowing? I don't know. And so I get to stay with that and think with it and slow down. And I think that's a really valuable part of this virtual conference space. So I guess the question I want to raise to everyone on the call at this point, because we do have another 15 minutes and a lot of people who do similar work, and we could have a great conversation broadening it to them. But I wonder what it is about this disruption of COVID-19 and education business as usual that we want to continue to engage with, or what are some of the disruptions that we're seeing in our own work and in the way that we see education? How can we rethink education in the Anthropocene and Thulacene? So I'd love for everyone else to jump in too, or raise other questions, and I'll stop there.
I do want to say one teeny tiny microbial thing. Just quickly, thank you everyone for your amazing work. And obviously there's not enough time to talk about it all. But I've been thinking so much in the last few years. I'm aware of the warnings about anthropomorphism and animism as just reframing the world in human terms. And I continue to grapple with it because I work with young children, and that's what they do. And what I've come to just personally, I feel like this is one of those, there is no answer. It's what works for you. And then understanding Stenger's work, or Stenger's words about that, is that it's a kind of a thought experiment, similar to place stories, where we're describing something in terms of its animacy and its life from an other than human perspective. Like the land coming to life, what would the land say? And although it is problematic, I think it can also be useful if we keep it in check. So even as I answer that, there's a conflict in it, but something I continue to play with, and I appreciate it being brought up today in this context.
Angela, I share that same concern, because it's like we're trying to give it human life, but it has its own life too. And so I still really struggle with the idea of giving voice. You know, that's the question that Inés raised, because it's like we have to understand it in human terms, and for me in the English language, or, you know, and all of that giving life that's already there, that already exists in relationship to us, but also beyond us. So it's such a good question that you raised. And Marianne has a comment too, I can see.
Just on this conversation, it reminded me of a little book that I read a couple of years ago called The Hidden Life of Trees. I don't know if you've heard of it, Janna. I see you nodding. It's written by Peter Wohlleben, and he's a forester. And the subtitle for it is The Hidden Life of Trees, What They Feel, How They Communicate, Discoveries from the Secret World. And he studied trees as a forester, I think he's like has had an education in as an arborist. I can't even think of the words. And it's absolutely fascinating account of how trees think. He doesn't use that word, but how they communicate and how they feel with one another from a scientific perspective. And I, use that word like this too. And anyway, and he does it in such a way that for me as a reader was not anthropomorphizing the trees, attributing human actions and thoughts and ideas to non-human beings. So I just want to put that out there as something to, a little resource to take a look at. It changed my way of thinking about trees and my relationship with trees, very much so.
Thank you so much.
I also wonder about, is it the right question to ask, how do we be less human in our own thinking about, like, can we ever get out of the fact that we are human? So just thinking about reading Indigenous philosophy and theory, which is something that's really important, I think, to go to, because there is so much of this work has actually been done for us already, and it's there. We don't need to reinvent it, where Indigenous scholarship has talked for a long time about non-human persons. And so it's not so much about jumping out of our anthropomorphic selves, our human selves, but understanding ourselves as having relationship to already and having obligations to non-human persons and others. And then just in terms of COVID-19, I mean, what I've seen a lot of interesting talk and scholarship around is all of a sudden people are realizing that we are animals, because we are, right? And so understanding that we share a virus with animals that can affect us in these horrible ways, you have this kind of sudden shock of, oh, we're actually very much connected with other creatures on the earth, and forgetting that connection is an issue that has caused this virus to happen.
If I could build on that, Nisha, I was thinking what you said about Indigenous knowledge is sometimes I just feel really sorry for us that we are like discovering things that people have known for so long, and it's so exciting, and we just get really energized by this, but it's been around forever, and it's too bad that we don't already have that as part of our Western education system. But something that I'm trying to do in my dissertation, so I agree with the question of, can we even like abandon being human? And the answer is no, not really. But how can we see ourselves differently, interrelated to the earth? And so what I'm trying to play with in my dissertation is something I'm calling Shapeshifting Stardust. So if we all come from the same stardust, from stars that exploded millennia ago, how do we see ourselves as having the ability to shift shape, because we do shape shift, and we just don't call it that. You know, this session has taken place now 3 times, let's say, because we recorded these presentations. We tried to have it once, we're having it again. We have to be flexible and shift shape, and we're spiraling through the universe, and we're never in the same place. So how can we see our human selves as something other than just like, you know, human? But then when we do that, we can't ignore all of the destruction that our human selves are causing, and all of that colonial history of our humanity. So it's such a great question that it's with me all the time, and I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to address it in my dissertation. How am I going to address my own humanity and my positionality as a Western human? So.
Yeah, and another way to think is what version of the human, right? That's why it's also kind of good to look at Winter's work, or people who write about Winter is easier than just reading Sylvia Winter.
I also wanted to reflect on can we get out of being human? And I think with nationalism, I have an easy way, right? Nationalism is a human concept, right? We are thinking in nations. We are created the world divided up as nations formed by countries and maps and borders and all that stuff. So for me, actually, to get to this idea of how to draw this together with a modern human thinking was, I think, the first block that I had to get through, right? And I think that I'm therefore very, very conscious of humans and how we can think about it in this human term of nation, right? And bring in others. So it's very, very provocative thing, I think.
If I may, something about the indigenous knowledge that for me at least, it's not a way of discovering something that was out there, no, and we forgot, and it's unchanged, you know, and to take it, I don't know, romanticize it, no, they knew how to live and we forgot, and I don't know, of course, I don't know if they knew or not, and if you look, again, as a historian, I wouldn't romanticize many ways of living of, for example, pre-Columbian times in Latin America. They were not ideal at all, no? And they were very different societies. And it's not just a question of judging them, but trying to understand our world. And I would try to think of, I mean, how can we use indigenous knowledges today? Well, in a way, as Nisha, I think, was saying, it's different ways of living with the world, and how can, and I think in that respect, the post-colonial is very important. We cannot go back to a pre-colonial, no? We have to live with the complexities we have. These are very complex societies. We have many different ways of living, no, in the world. And for me, and I don't know, it was also interesting because I've been participating in lots of conversations about COVID in Latin America, and the main thing that comes out is inequalities, no? Inequalities, and I think that's also something that speaks of our different ways of living and our different selves in the world and conditions of living. And then, yeah, there are many ways of being human, and the importance of rights is still there. No, we don't have to forget them. But I don't know, many things there, but sorry.
Kathy Bickmore was writing a few things in the chat about the gender composition of this panel and this session. Kathy, did you want to say anything about that?
It's uncooked. I've appreciated this session a lot. I'll say that, and just I'm not at all surprised that it's female people who are showing interest in these concerns, but it's a bit like, I can't help, because of my work in peace building, thinking about the latest round of mass murders in Nova Scotia, which is again linked directly to misogyny. And yet none of us talked about the link to misogyny in the destruction of the environment and the disrespect of the more than human beings in the world. I kind of think we're going to have to name that issue in order to get anywhere and study it somehow. I wish you'd help me think about how.
Thanks, Kathy.
Yeah, when I say this question of which version of the human, it's because the human is very often reflected in this figure of cisgendered, able-bodied, white, property owning, money making, straight male.
And also reading the chat and great points by Garin and Narda. Wonderful, thank you.
Thinking maybe we could take some of those points from the chat and we could move them over to our website, and then we can continue the conversation asynchronously there. So I'll send a link to where the website is, and if anyone wants to repost their comments there, you can already do so, and we can continue this discussion elsewhere. But last few minutes, we have 5 minutes left. If anyone else wanted to raise any points out loud, go ahead, Marianne.
So one of the things that the comments and the discussion made me think about, and this is also in light of Zsuzsa and Sirpa's work, is what we can learn from children. I think in terms of our relationship with the natural world, and young children, little children, preschool children, there's a lot that we can learn just by watching how they engage with one another and with the world around them. I haven't got a clue what this means in terms of my own research and my own thinking about what I do, but I suspect that there's something there. And I'm just wondering if others on the panel or here in the group might want to think about that, as in terms of this thinking beyond the Anthropocene, what young children can teach us before we mess them up in schools.
So this is kind of how my research started. I went to Brazil over 2 winters. So I had a 6-month study, but it was 3 months at a time. And I came back and all I was talking about were the children and the children and the children. And my advisor, Iveta, everyone knows Iveta, was like, you're really talking about these children a lot. When you go back for the next 3 months, why don't you focus on children? And so when I looked at it theoretically and methodologically, I looked at a lot of the early childhood education literature. There's a really robust body of literature about children and the more than human world from the Common Worlds Collective and all of that. But as I continue with the writing, I'm still troubled by centering the child and then what they see in their worlds, because it's more about all of the interconnections, not necessarily from the child out, but at the same time, children are more interconnected than we are with certain parts of the more than human world, I would argue. We lose some of that connection and we unlearn it, I think. So for me, it was a great starting point, and I'm still struggling with how not to center the child and the child's voice, and how not to say that I'm giving voice to children, that children were co-researchers. So it's such a great question to raise. And I'm really happy that Angela's here. I saw she made a comment in the chat about her research too with children and plastic.
I have a moment to say something. Sirpa was here with us, and she wanted me to read her comment. She said, just send my warm thanks for the thought-provoking session to commentators and all participants. Cheers.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone else.